Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you, Erica, as well. Thanks to the Journalism and Communication Department for hosting me here, both tonight and for the entire year as a visiting scholar. I'm really glad to be here. I actually spend most of my time, my work time in New Jersey now, where I direct this project that Kathy mentioned. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I still live in Southampton, Massachusetts. And so it's really nice to come here and have colleagues and a community of people to talk through these issues with, and to work with bringing the stuff that I'm doing in New Jersey back here to Western Massachusetts. I actually grew up in a place not that much different than Western Massachusetts. I grew up in Ithaca, New York. It's a college town, very much like Amherst and Northampton, and every year the population of the city would double when the students came back into town. So the life of the community was very much connected with the life of the universities. And yet the campuses felt somehow always separate. They were up on the hill, they were literally behind their own walls. And where my life intersected with these campuses was primarily in the realm of culture. My family would go to Cornell soccer games, and I would go to Ithaca College Theater. But really, my most direct connection was through the radio waves. I listened to college radio growing up, and eventually actually worked in college radio. And still today, whenever I get back to Ithaca, the first thing I do is flip over to WICB, Ithaca College Broadcasting. So college radio, both listening to it and making it, had a profound impact on my life and my career. But it's also a useful lens through which to consider the media moment that we're in, the future of journalism, and the civic demands of higher education. So in 2015, we actually are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the intercollegiate broadcasting system. But today, college radio is facing tough times. I know here at UMass there's debates about the local station here. I honestly don't know enough about the specific case to comment on that. But I do know that around the country, phones and apps are changing the way that we listen to music and radio. And increasingly, we see college campuses selling off their broadcast licenses to public broadcasting or other entities. What does this look like sort of on the ground? Well, just last year, Georgia Public Broadcasting actually bought the majority of the time, 14 hours a day, from a local Georgia State University college radio station. So now 14 hours a day, that college radio station actually is essentially a local NPR affiliate. In Salon, Garrett Martin wrote this about that station. Quote, WRAS 88.5 FM in Atlanta was the first radio station to play Outkast. It was one of the first few stations in the country to play REM, Deer Hunter, and the Indigo Girls. Today, as I said, it's largely a local NPR affiliate. So why does this matter? For me, it's not about saving college radio stations so much as about reviving and reclaiming universities' role as laboratories for the future of media. In his 2009 book, Radio's Hidden Voice, historian Hugh Slotin wrote, quote, radio stations at universities were particularly important because they pioneered some of the earliest experiments with radio in the United States. And they played a key role in the establishment of an alternative, non-commercial public service model for broadcasting. But college radio and student media in general is just one piece of the puzzle. Today, students and universities are charting new paths towards connecting campuses and communities through powerful journalism and engaged learning. Radio was once cutting-edge technology, and campuses were pioneers in experimenting with how that technology could be used to serve the public. Today, we need to bring that same spirit of experimentation and leadership to the biggest questions facing our communities and our newsrooms. So college radio was where my story began. But since then, I've spent 15 years working to transform institutions to make them more responsive to and reflective of their communities. This idea that has animated all of my work, from universities to newsrooms, has been that we are stronger when we build with communities, not for them. Build with, not for. What do I mean by that? Well, my friend, the civic technologist Lauren Ellen McCann, puts it this way. Quote, with implies togetherness, a network. Acting with others implies a certain degree of collaboration, collective action, coordination. You run a three-legged race with your partner, or you fall flat in your face. By contrast, she says, when we use the word for, we center on the experience of individuals, with one acting on behalf of the other. In the for universe, there are actors and there are those acted upon. So with that in mind, how might we use universities as leverage points to build new kinds of journalism with communities? That's what I want to explore today. When I graduated from college, I spent a year serving with AmeriCorps and the Student Conservation Association. That's a picture of me many years earlier and many pounds lighter on the top of a mountain in the Adirondack Park. We were in the Adirondack, so in the winter months, we weren't out doing much of this. We were in local schools teaching environmental education and science. When we were in the summer and spring months, we were out doing trail work, building bridges, helping maintain the land. However, those two were always separate, the service and the education. And when I finished my time in AmeriCorps, I went to work for an organization called Campus Compact, which was working to combine coursework and community work. Campus Compact is a coalition of more than 1,000 college and university presidents who are committed to renewing the civic purposes of higher education. We challenged campuses to become engaged through actions and teaching with their communities, because we believed that higher education needed to renew its civic role as agents of a democracy. Those words were from Campus Compact's President's Declaration of Civic Responsibility, which also stated, quote, "Higher education is uniquely positioned to help Americans understand the histories and contours of our present challenges as a diverse democracy. It is also uniquely positioned to help both students and our communities to explore new ways of fulfilling the promise of justice and dignity for all." I began working on this speech before the recent events at Missouri and Ithaca and other places around the country. But I read over that quote again today, and I can't help but think how important that role is today. While at Campus Compact, I worked with faculty across almost every discipline who were building long-standing partnerships with their communities. However, almost entirely absent from that work were journalism departments. We did have some pioneering faculty in communication, doing service learning and civic engagement, and actually many of them were here at UMass. And that was one of the things that brought me to UMass after I left Campus Compact. I came here to Amherst to work in the Office of Civic Engagement and Service Learning while pursuing my master's degree in American Studies. UMass was a fitting place to land for me because the part of the work I was doing at Campus Compact was so rooted in the land-grant history of American public higher education. Now, how many of you are familiar with the history of land grants in America? I see about half the room. So I'm going to wander off into just a bit of policy history, and I know that's dangerous territory for anyone not speaking in C-SPAN. So I'm going to move quickly through this, I promise. Land-grant colleges were established by the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890, which gave federal land and federal dollars to states to establish and endow public universities that would focus on teaching agricultural and industrial skills. That's a big part of UMass's history. It was once known as the Massachusetts Agricultural College. And side note, the first newspaper at UMass actually predates the campus pond by 2 years. So journalism has been a part of this work for a long time. After the first Morrill Act, the Hatch Act was passed, which established agricultural experiment stations at these land-grant campuses. Agricultural experiment stations. Then after the second Morrill Act, Congress passed the Smith-Lever Act to create a cooperative extension program that would pay university staff to travel the countryside and take the findings of their research out to farmers around the country. So before universities were laboratories for new media, like radio in the 1900s, they were laboratories for agriculture and technology. And in both cases, the goal was to serve the public outside the boundaries of the university walls. In fact, Hugh Slotton, who I mentioned earlier, wrote in his history of campus radio about the importance of radio, particularly at land-grant institutions, because they did extension, education, and what we would call today online courses over the radio airwaves as early as the 1920s, long before Moodle. So I think these two histories have something profoundly useful to teach us today. In the last decade, we have seen profound changes in journalism, media, and technology, and everyone in this room is aware of those. I don't need to go over them. I think Chris Anderson, who was here just a couple weeks ago, Emily Bell, and Clay Shirky summed it up fairly well when they wrote that we have entered a post-industrial age of journalism. They argue that you cannot look at the diverse apps, websites, platforms, publishers, nonprofits, for-profits, citizen journalists, live streamers, etc., and find anything like coherence. This age is full of profound opportunities, but also enormous challenges. So if that's the case, what's the role of journalism and communication schools in a post-industrial journalism age? How do we prepare students for a future when the future is rushing at us every minute? And how do students learn skills for jobs that haven't been created yet? Really, if democracy does depend on a free press, what does today's democracy demand of us? A number of people have tried to answer that question. In 2009, during the height of newspaper layoffs and closures, Leonard Downey, the former executive editor of the Washington Post, and Michael Schudson, a professor of communication at Columbia University, wrote, quote, "Universities, both public and private, should become ongoing sources of reporting as part of their educational missions. They should operate their own news organizations and be laboratories for digital innovation in the gathering and sharing of news and information." The next year, in 2010, the Knight Commission on the Information Needs of Communities traveled the country, held hundreds of forums, and from that they invoked America's land-grant history to argue that, quote, "No longer does extension signify a lonely agent driving an aging station wagon out to share crop information with area farmers. From the largest research universities to America's more than 1,000 community colleges, the best of higher education sector is translating faculty research and practical resources for individuals and communities. Institutions of higher learning should likewise regard promoting community information as central to their mission," including, the Knight Commission importantly argued, rewarding faculty whose research engages in local communities and supporting student-driven civic projects. Finally, in 2014, Anderson, Bell, and Shirky, who I mentioned above, argue that universities need to be increasingly dynamic and responsive to the changing external landscape. They said, quote, "The careers students head into will be more variable and more dependent on their ability to create their own structure, as opposed to simply fitting in positions in well-known collection of rich and stable institutions. The fate of the journalism in the United States is now more squarely in the hands of individual journalists than it is in the institutions that support them." Unquote. So that brings me to what I'm doing in New Jersey. In New Jersey, we're working with a number of universities, testing out these and other roles. I still live here in Western Massachusetts, as I said, but for the last year I've been directing the Journalism and Sustainability Project at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, a very small foundation with very big ideas about local news. Through this program, we're experimenting with new revenue models, community engagement strategies, and more with 6 local sites, news sites, that range from just getting off the ground to having been around for about 7 years. So I coach them on business development, I coach them on digital storytelling skills, I coach them on outreach and collaboration, and we're documenting everything we're learning in these experiments at localnewslab.org. Local news in New Jersey has always been a bit of an oddity. It's caught between the nation's two of the nation's biggest media markets, Philly and New York. And for a long time, there's never been much local news in New Jersey when it comes to radio and TV. Those outlets have focused on New York and Philadelphia. It's gotten so bad that New Jersey citizens a couple years ago filed a formal complaint with the Federal Communications Commission, claiming that these licensees weren't living up to their civic purposes for having their broadcast licenses. To complicate things, about 5 years ago, amidst dramatic cuts at local newspapers, the governor of New Jersey decided to sell off the public broadcasting licenses to New York and Philly. So even our public broadcasting in the state is controlled by New York and Philadelphia. Many New Jersey communities were becoming news deserts. All around us, the institutions that we relied on were faltering. But in response to this, we saw incredible entrepreneurship and ingenuity. In communities across New Jersey, people who cared about their local communities were starting something new. These were laid-off journalists, they were business people, they were open government advocates, they were citizen journalists. They were starting blogs and websites, starting to cover their communities the best way that they could, the best way they knew how, and then starting to try to make a living out of it. At the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, we looked over these diverse efforts, large and small, old and new, on and offline, and we decided that if local news was going to thrive here, it would not be by relying on a one-size-fits-all approach. So we embraced what we call an ecosystem approach. Jeff Jarvis, the director of the Tao Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at CUNY, who's also a board member of our foundation, described the ecosystem this way, quote, "New Jersey, like most every market, has a growing and disorganized hodgepodge of sites, services, communities, and individuals that operate on various platforms with different motivations, with more or fewer resources, and with business models from none to nonprofit, to hoping for profit, to profitable. And they all contribute to a larger ecosystem of information in the state," unquote. So this approach, this ecosystem approach, recognizes that long-standing newsrooms and new startups, beat coverage and citizen journalism, watchdog reporting, and neighborhood news all have a role to play in informing communities. But media ecosystems, just like natural ecosystems, can be healthy or unhealthy. And for a long time, the New Jersey ecosystem has been unhealthy. It's been a mess, with little coordination, inadequate resources, mixed quality, huge gaps in coverage. New Jersey has 565 municipalities. There's no way right now, with the resources that we have, we can cover all of those communities to the depth they need to be covered. So when natural ecosystems are healthy, they are interdependent, each of the small parts connected by systems and networks. So that's the metaphor that we're using for what we're trying to create in New Jersey. We're working to create a more connected, collaborative, and inclusive statewide network for local news in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And we see universities as key nodes, as anchor institutions in this work and helping build these networks. We're currently partnering with 4 universities and 6 departments across those universities, and we're talking to at least 2 or 3 other universities at this time too. Each of these projects highlights different roles that campuses can play in strengthening local news. So I want to give you a snapshot of that work, as well as point out a couple of the most exciting and interesting roles I think universities are playing across the US as well, to see what other people are doing and what we might learn from that. So the first thing we did when we wanted to build this ecosystem approach was to found the Center for Cooperative Media and the New Jersey News Commons. This is a central coordinating body in New Jersey that now has over 120 members who are everything from the biggest news organizations in the state down to the smallest individual citizen journalists. And they work across this membership to offer business and journalism training, opportunities for collaborative reporting, a story exchange for content sharing. They do peer-to-peer learning, networking, legal help, a whole range of other services. But they're the hub that helps network together this whole state. And they're shifting the culture of journalism in New Jersey from one of competition to one of collaboration. It's really profound what they've been able to do in a couple years. They've also taken a lead in open data and sponsored 2 hackathons connecting programmers with journalists. The Tao Knight Center, who I mentioned earlier, Jeff Jarvis's entrepreneurial journalism program at CUNY, has led important research to model sustainability models for local journalism and to play out what sample budgets and activities might look like. They've also done a whole series of in-depth reports on new revenue streams, from events and membership models to local news ad networks, sales, and other community engagement strategies. And in a project that we're co-funding with the Democracy Fund out of Washington, D.C., Phil Napoli at Rutgers Media and the Public Interest Initiative has produced 2 reports for us. One is a mapping of local news resources in Newark, New Brunswick, and Morristown, 3 very different communities. Newark is the largest, but also poorest community in the state. New Brunswick is a large struggling community with a college town and big hospital sort of industry. And then Morristown is a suburban town, fairly wealthy. And what he found in that research was staggering. Essentially, economic inequality is followed by information inequality. So the number of news articles written about these towns or that these folks had access to varied dramatically, with Morristown, the smallest of the three, having 23% more than Newark, New Jersey. The other report that Phil did for us was to go in those different areas and actually conduct focus groups to find out what were people's news habits, what were their needs and wants from local news. And through those focus groups, I took those reports and went back to the local news organizations of those states, and we strategized about how we could build new products and services and how we could tell better stories that more connected to the daily lives of people living in those places. So we used that research directly and immediately in strategies for strengthening local news. And I should note that Martha Fuentes Bautista here in the communication department has done similar work locally here in Western Massachusetts. Another project, we have Professor Ellen Goodman at Rutgers Law, who is using grad students and law students in her program to create an interactive, frequently asked questions guide to legal issues for news entrepreneurs in New Jersey. So these are everything for how do you file an open public records request to what do you do if you get threatening comments in your Facebook feed. Professor Todd Wolfson at Rutgers Journalism School is creating a community-driven social justice lab for reporting with his students. And then outside New Jersey, we've worked with Professor Rich Gordon's analytics class at the Medill School at Northwestern to do analytics audits of our sites to figure out where their audience is coming from, what stories are working and what's not, and then to design new strategies for engaging people digitally. Just because we're in a post-industrial journalism age does not mean we don't need the resilience, the strengths, and the capacities of news institutions. Many of the functions I just described above have traditionally lived inside newsrooms, in marketing departments, in legal departments, in administrative departments. But community media and small newsrooms don't have access to those sorts of resources. They don't get to have someone come to rush to the rescue if they get sued. They're one lawsuit away from being shut down. Limited resources and tight staffing also make it really hard for these newsrooms to take a step back and to adapt to the changing media landscape around them because they're so focused on the daily grind of putting out journalism. That was the topic of a report coming out of Duke University called "The Goat Must Be Fed." This constant churn and how that constant churn is actually holding back people from adapting to the new media age. And the authors of that report said that for all the celebrations that we have about how the internet has changed journalism, they say, quote, "The bloom in digital journalism is still occurring disproportionately at the larger news organizations, with small papers and many broadcast outlets left far behind." Universities can help meet this challenge. We can be vital partners in strengthening local news. And I see this playing out in a few ways. Journalism schools are increasingly becoming news providers, embracing a sort of teaching hospital approach to teaching journalism. There are lots of examples of this, including reporting done here by Steve Fox's journalism class that ended up in the Boston Globe. In Milwaukee, the Journal Sentinel has developed a fellowship program with Marquette University where a senior reporter spends 9 months on campus teaching and also pursuing an investigative journalism piece with students that then gets published in the newspaper. In California, USC Annenberg helped build a multilingual local news site that engages local teens, college students, faculty, and community members in reporting on their community. That was called Alhambra Source. This is a snapshot of that. Universities can also provide training and consulting for local newsrooms. Boston University offers a data storytelling workshop. Stanford, Missouri, Harvard all offer fellowships. Here at UMass, Brian McDermott has created a fantastic online training that are accessible to the public as well as to any media out there who wants to beef up their skills in visual storytelling. But what else could we do? Campuses are also full of experts outside of these disciplines. What if business school faculty and MBAs helped small local newsrooms with their business plans? What if Computer science faculty or OIT staff were freed up for a little bit of time and rewarded for helping journalists with data journalism, computer-assisted reporting, or even just fixing their websites. Campuses can serve as research and development labs for journalism as well. Journalism and communication faculty can align their research agendas with the current immediate needs of local newsrooms, and we can help incubate important projects that can serve the whole industry. So the Reese News Lab here at North Carolina, they work with teams of students to prototype technologies and projects for newsrooms all over the country, as well as local newsrooms. One of their students created this mobile storytelling and digital journalism lab, and she and her team raised $50,000 to take it around the country, and they're traveling around the country right now. It's called Driven Media, and they're telling stories from a women's perspective, women-created journalism about immigrant issues all over the country in this big RV that's outfitted as a mobile journalism lab. That came out of the Reese News Lab, $50,000 in crowdfunding, and they're off and running. It's a great project. The Knight Media Lab at Northwestern has developed a tool set of open source storytelling tools for mapping, building timelines, engagement tools. All of those are open and free to the industry, and they're used all the time. NYU Studio 20 is partnering with Fusion and the Parson Design School to come up with new ways of covering the presidential election through the lens of a millennial. So these are all sort of research and development opportunities that we can directly impact the conversation and the needs of local newsrooms while also moving important research forward. And then finally, revenue and sustainability. So we can also subsidize journalism. Subsidize sounds like a dirty word, but journalism has also always been subsidized, whether it was ads subsidizing international reporting or whether it was classifieds or other forms of subsidy. So subsidy just means that we have an opportunity to help pay the bills a little bit. We can do that in a couple ways. Quite simply, we can use our advertising budgets for our arts programs, for our athletics, and make sure we're spending some money on local media. But more creatively than that, we're seeing events, for example, becoming a major revenue stream for journalism around the country. The Texas Tribune this year, in 2015, made $1.5 million on their events, and almost 90% of them are hosted by universities. So universities and the Texas Tribune are partnering to create these amazing journalism events. You can see this is their Texas Tribune Festival. You can see down here, hosted on the campus of University of Texas, Austin. And I know that budgets are tight, timeline is tight, but these don't have to be extras. They don't have to be revenue negative for us either. Each of these things are opportunities for student learning and opportunities for faculty research, but they're also opportunities to do revenue sharing with a local newsroom or to get grants. There is, I'm sorry, I just skipped by something here. So in terms of grants, the Online News Association actually organized 5 major national foundations to put together a $1 million challenge fund for just this kind of work. They say they want to help universities to create new journalism experiences that partner with news organizations and, quote, explore new ways of providing information to their local communities. Not to mention, the Knight Foundation just gave $3 million to UNC to build on the Reese News Lab and other work that they're doing there in terms of researching how the role the university can play in supporting local journalism. And I think that's actually a drop in the bucket. I actually think there's a lot more dollars out there to support this kind of work, this kind of innovation, community-driven journalism work that's placing universities as these important hubs. And I think that that's out there from foundations, and it's also out there from individual donors. The Reynolds Journalism Institute is partially funded by an alumni of the Missouri School of Journalism. The Reese News Lab is donated by somebody named Reese. It's out there, and I think it's a really important opportunity for us to build and support new kinds of journalism and new kinds of teaching. So I get really excited when I talk about this stuff. I get excited thinking about what's possible to connect classrooms, communities, and newsrooms around innovation and civic engagement. In between my time at UMass and my time at the Dodge Foundation, I spent 7 years running national advocacy campaigns on press freedom, media diversity, and digital rights. And in that time, I got to travel all over the country, talking with local people about the media in their communities. And I saw over and over and over again a hunger for people who wanted better local news. and an eagerness to fight for that local news. That hasn't always translated into a willingness to pay for that local news. But I would say that that's changing. We're seeing more and more willingness for people to pay for media, whether it's a Netflix subscription or a Spotify subscription or crowdfunding of local journalism. So I think some of those things are shifting. But here in Western Massachusetts, I think we see, even amidst vast educational resources and a pretty rich media environment, there are still communities that are going largely unserved when it comes to local media. And we can do something about that. Too often when we talk about innovation in journalism, we talk about the biggest tech companies partnering with the biggest newsrooms in the biggest cities in America. That to me is a troublingly narrow view of what innovation should look like. We face a unique moment in time today. We should embrace the history of universities as spaces of experimentation in media and places dedicated to serving communities outside their walls. If we seize this moment of profound challenge and opportunity, this moment of discovery and collaboration, I think we can create something amazing. When Lyndon Johnson signed the legislation that established the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, he said this: "We must consider new ways of building a great network for knowledge. The time has come to stake another claim in the name of all people, to stake a claim based on the combined resources of communications. I believe the time has come to enlist the computer and the satellite, as well as the television and the radio, to enlist them in the cause of education." I always marveled that this was 1976 and he was talking about great networks of knowledge and computers and satellites. We're living that today. We're living in the age of Johnson's great network of knowledge, but we're still leaving people behind. Universities and newsrooms are two of the most important nodes in this great network of knowledge. And the reality is that while journalism and education have long existed as separate industries, we have shared common cause in supporting civic life and democracy in America. So today, it's critical that we embrace that common cause together. Thank you.